Welcome to the first of a series of articles about comic books and, to start with, their long history with Australia. This series is sponsored by Horror, the first time America's Paranoia infected the world, my own book covering the international war on comic books in the 1950s. To start, I thought I would cover a timely historical event, one that matches up perfectly with something that's occurred last week. As some of you may be aware, Australians suffered a strange event as an international media company began blocking access to the nation's own media sources. Australia has a habit of picking fights with enormous international organisations it sees as doing the wrong thing, and more often than not, winning. In 2012, the Australian government took on the tobacco industry and forced it to remove all advertising and sell their product in plain packages, often with disturbing images of cancer and other smoking-related issues on the cover. This stance was quickly followed by other Western nations like France and New Zealand, and this week the world's governments are focused on Australia as the country takes on the giant tech industries like Facebook and Google. For years, there's been a growing issue of these online empires using and accessing media products by other media outlets without paying for said rights. The Australian government has had trouble taxing the income generated by these companies, and the idea that they were making even more money by using products they had no right to was the final straw. Introducing a new law that would see these companies pay for the use of content generated by other companies, Facebook immediately turned around and blocked all Australians from accessing not only articles and pages from news organisations, but the pages from government services like the fire department and hospitals. And it did this during a global pandemic. Today, CNN has just released an article about what's happening, and they mention the eyes of the world are all on Australia now, as other nations will likely introduce similar laws if Australia succeeds, and I'll link this report below. Google has already blinked and has organised a payment schedule with many Australian news and media providers. Microsoft, who owns the search engine Bing, has also stepped up and decided to pay, even pointing out healthy news organisations are good for everyone. But Facebook has decided to play hardball with its nationwide ban on all Australian media content, and it's even affected my Australian publisher, Odyssey Books, as I cannot share links to my own books at the moment. I'm no fan of the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, but I will give him a tip of the hat for his very Australian sense of humour, as he just posted a release on his own Facebook account, pointing out tech giants like Facebook and Google may be changing the world, but that does not mean they run it. It's interesting that over the last week, many talking heads have heralded this being a new issue of a modern technological world, with international companies inflicting damage on local media markets. The argument, however, is actually an old one. The 1940s and 50s were a strange time in the world. The planet had just suffered through a horrendous world war, and one result of the conflict was the sudden globalization of the United States of America, or more importantly, the globalization of American culture. Before the war, the US was just one of many nations producing mass media such as music, radio, books, movies, and comic books. Yet as the world slipped into war, America flexed its industrial might and called on its seemingly unlimited manpower to send armies across the globe to help defeat fascism and imperialism. These troops not only brought guns and tanks and warplanes and warships, they also brought a little slice of home with them. American troops wanted American goods, and so movies, music, magazines, and comics were sent in the hundreds of thousands across the globe, where they not only entertained the troops, but the locals as well. The taste for all things American didn't leave once the war was over and the troops returned home either. A review of comic strips after the Second World War revealed they had become so successful they could now be found in almost every magazine and newspaper. Statistics showed just in America some 70 to 100 million Americans were reading newspaper comic strips every day, making them the most dominant art form in the world at the time. Movies only managed an audience of some 90 million a week, roughly 1/6 of that of comics. These comics were cheap to produce, and those that didn't sell well, they were collected, bundled, and placed as ballast in ships sailing across the Atlantic and Pacific. This ballast would then be dumped in Australian and English ports, where they could be bought by magazine distributors for pennies on the dollar and put into circulation. With far less regulation than the printing companies operating in Australia and England, these American comics were exciting, brutal, even racy, and they became extremely popular. These imports were creating a serious financial drain to countries that had lost so much during the war. Many Commonwealth nations were saddled with vast war loans, but to buy US goods, they now had to send thousands, sometimes millions of dollars to American companies, money that traditionally had remained at home in the pockets of local artists and publishers. When the war ended in 1945, England was left in an extremely precarious position. More than half of the nation's industries have been converted to producing war material, and with this need now gone, the mercantile empire that once ruled the world found itself with very few exports left to ship overseas. Needing to rebuild after the war and invest in its own national infrastructure in such programs as welfare and national health systems, the empire was forced to borrow $4.3 billion, roughly $50 billion today, from the US, with Canada pitching in another $1 billion or so. To understand how much of a burden this was, England made its final repayment of $83 million on these loans in 2006. One significant effect of this short ban was the growth of the English comic industry. Comic books such as Eagle, Lion, Tiger, as well as older titles like Dandy, grew so popular that even when US comics returned, their readership remained strong. Being so much closer and so more affected by these imports, Canada acted much earlier in banning the sale of American comic books. During the war, Canada introduced the War Exchange Conversion Act in 1940. This allowed only essential war products to be purchased from the US, allowing Canada to curtail its growing deficit with its largest trading partner. This ended the flood of US comics into the country, and just like England, had the added bonus of allowing Canadian publications to thrive. New comic companies soon appeared, and though all produced their own homegrown titles, this wasn't the end of US comics, as some of these companies saved money by simply purchasing US scripts, then had local artists draw the issue to help skirt this new law. During the war, the Australian government had also banned the importation of American comics, partly for the same reason as England and Canada. The nation's finances were hard pressed during the war, and American imports were creating an imbalance in Australia's deficit and exchange rate. This ban was enacted thanks to the implementation of an old 1906 law, the Australian Industries Preservation Act. Senator Donald Cameron had fronted Australia's Parliament as far back as 1939 to explain how these imports were affecting local artists and printers. As evidence, he recalled how 3 steamers, the Yomachi, the Tampa and the Mahout, had discharged no fewer than 305,200 copies of fact-dated American magazines in Sydney. Australia had become a dumping ground for US comics and magazines that had not sold. These were bought cheaply, sent as ballast in ships, and landed much the same way they had in England. These cheap publications suppressed the local market, and Cameron argued that by using certain laws, they could enforce a ban against them. These laws were later enforced when it was reported US dollars had to be purchased from England at a much higher rate of pay for these imports, and this was causing a great strain on the economy. These restrictions were kept for some time after the war ended, as Australia's national debt was now so high it attempted to keep money inside its own economy by limiting US goods. Just like England and Canada, this embargo allowed the local market to blossom, and one study suggests that 50 million comics, many locally produced, were sold in Australia in 1951. Australia actually had a history of comic publishing, with characters like Ginger Meggs, Fatty Finn, and arguably the nation's most famous cartoon, Felix the Cat, created in the 1920s. Yes, Felix the Cat is Australian, and I will explain this in a later article. Still, many local comics suffered due to foreign comic imports, but thanks to the 1940s ban came the world's longest continuous running comic book, The Phantom. Though this hero was not created in Australia, as a young nation made up of mostly immigrants, it's interesting to note this African superhero, created in the US, is most decidedly an Australian now. Frew Publications has been printing The Phantom since 1948 and still successfully publishes the comic today, even in the face of strong international opposition. Things change, however, and as 1949 began, many of these laws were being eroded away by powerful media moguls who owned many of the country's newspapers. It all then got serious when a comic war broke out, bringing back many of the same arguments from the start of the war about US imports. For years, comics were the country's #1 media, with newspapers carrying daily comic strips that were devoured by kids and adults alike. For some time, local artists had managed to retain a small presence thanks to the ban at the start of the war, with some local comics remaining the most popular amongst readers even in the presence of US imports. A western and rip-off of the Lone Ranger, called Lone Avenger by Aussie Len Lawson, was more popular than Superman in the late 1940s. And trust me, we will be hearing more about Len Lawson later. By the end of the decade, comic readership was booming, and the nation's most influential newspapers went to war with each other to try and win the nation's readership. The Sunday Herald, Sunday Sun, and Sunday Telegraph started buying more and more almost entirely US syndicated series to fill their ever-expanding comic section. As one paper added a strip, the others felt they needed to respond, and suddenly comics of every type were being shoehorned into these papers with little rhyme or reason. Many tales were even started after the story had been running for years, leaving the readers scratching their heads as to what the series was about. On the 22nd of January 1949, Sydney's Tribune newspaper published an article on the upcoming comic war, and right from the first line it let the reader know where it stood and the probable ramifications of this influx of foreign media to the nation's artists. Battle, murder, sudden death, and rape will be ladled out by the pageful tomorrow when entry of the Sunday Herald into the Sunday newspaper field will intensify the press barons' circulating war. Most of it will be Yankee syndicated material. In retaliation, the Sunday Sun and Sunday Telegraph also promised to inflict enlarged comic sections on their readers. Australian artists, writers and printers won't benefit because materials will be from America. This was helping to create a financial drain and impact directly certain of the nation's businesses. Customs Minister Cortese claims the strips do not involve dollars because the American owners let their payments stay in Australia. But figures compiled by Australian journalists show that Australia spends $1 million a year in royalty payments and for newsprint of comic strips. 2 years ago, 2 American comics were printed here. Today, the total is 33, and more titles are being printed weekly. The argument against comics was picked up across a country that many felt was plummeting into a recession. The Townsville Daily Bulletin reported that experts have estimated that Australia is still paying out between 40 and 50 million pounds in US dollars annually for items not classified as merchandise. And despite all these efforts, an abundance of American luxury goods can still be purchased in the shops. Sex magazines, horror strips, and syndicated stories flood Australia, while 90% of radio serials that are broadcast all day and night over more than 100 broadcasting stations are either recorded in America or the scripts used under royalty. Almost every musical record used on the air is earning dollars for the United States. The Daily Bulletin then asked the obvious question: does Canberra insist the sex magazines and novels and horror comics are necessary to improve Australian culture? The fact remains that dollars are still pouring out of this country, yet men on the land who need productive goods are told they must reserve dollars. The Daily Bulletin became something like a dog chomping on syndicated media as its favourite bone to chew on. Article after article was printed about the state of the nation's finances, and somewhere they always managed to sneak in a comment about imported comics. I should point out it wasn't just the money though. The Tribune again takes up the story. Experience in America, home of the comic books and comic strips, shows that comic aids to culture are debasing and harmful to young minds. 60 million copies of comics are now published monthly in America, and they are mainly blamed for staggering increases in cases of juvenile delinquency, murder and rape. Here are some American figures which authorities claim are directly traceable to comic strips. In 1948, minors were responsible for 31% of all rape cases. Minors were responsible for 12% of all murders. Minors were responsible for 44% of car thefts and 38% of burglaries. Of the 377,993 persons arrested between January and June 1948, 16,943 were under 18 years of age. Arrests of girls under 21 increased by 21% on 1947 figures. Today we know almost every story about crime rates in comic books was, if not fabricated, then at the very least their influence was overemphasized in the world's media. In fact, that's the main subject of my book, how so many stories of how kids were influenced by comics into committing heinous crimes has since been proven to be false, and in some cases, outright outrageous lies. Yet at the time this was a persuasive argument. Again we return to the Tribune's article about how Australia's trade deficit was being affected by US importation. Even in such a report, they felt they needed to warn their readers of the dangers of comic books. Slow poison. Dr. Frederick Wortham, senior psychiatrist of New York's Department of Hospitals, says comic strips are slowly poisoning the younger generation, and unless something is done to stop them, civilization may be at peril. They accustom a whole generation to cruelty and violence. They stimulate unhealthy sexual attitudes. They contribute to juvenile delinquency. It's not like this was a new argument for the Tribune either. 2 years earlier, the paper had carried another article spouting the same problems, though using a different tact. Here they tried to reveal the dangers US comics possessed to Australian jobs and schools. Comic strips link with US fascism. Syndication cut out a terrific amount of work for Australian tradesmen, authors and artists. Yet even here they could not help but slip into demonising not just the comics, but their readers. Some Australian comic strips are also to be deplored, but they are nothing to the volume of pornographic material that floods us from abroad. The Australian people are the only people in the world content to take their ideas in art and culture from other countries. You know you have a serious issue when the Australian RSL gets involved, and in the article a Mr. A. Burgest, representing the Returned Soldiers League, said, "Comic strips are degrading and the RSL will assist in the continuance of a campaign for the cleansing of this type of material." At the start of a new decade, Australia's Conservatives would move against not just comics, but most of the world's media of the day. The right-wing government may have been partly empowered by its success in the 1940s to ban lewd comic books. Again, what was happening in the US was being played out in Australia's media, only this time the opponent of comics found a willing partner in the government. This mostly occurred on a state level, with more conservative regions like South Australia and Queensland creating their own boards of inquiry into the damage crime and horror comics were doing to their kids. These led to local bans, and as Australia is a relatively small market, these embargoes had a serious effect on publishers and comic importers, with US comics drying up for some time. This effective tactic is one the Australian government is attempting again today. By moving to protect its local media from overseas influences, by enforcing laws that tech giants must pay for any Australian content they highlight on their sites, it's hoped a more level playing field can be created and local media can survive. It's worked before, and at this point, it seems to be working again. As for the creator of Australia's favourite comic in the 1940s, well, Len Lawson's story is for another day, or more precisely, another book. If you enjoy this series of articles on Australia's long and strange history with the comic book industry, please grab yourself a copy of my book. It not only covers what was happening in Australia, but across the globe, as the influence of American comic books started to take hold on the planet's youth. So thanks for your time, and please subscribe to the page, as there are many more great stories on the way.